The Sine Institute of Policy and Politics is American University's incubator for policy innovation. We convene leaders in the academic, public, private, nonprofit, and journalism sectors to engage and promote common ground and nonpartisan solutions. In an evolving world, we seize the opportunity to work on the nation's most pressing challenges through collaboration by experts and top scholars in their field with students in research and scholarship. As part of that goal, the Sine Institute leverages American University's location in our nation's capital, the nexus of government and a growing international business center. We connect diverse perspectives from around the country and around the world with our world-class academics and research, experienced practitioners, and the most politically active student body in the U.S. We stand apart through our focus on the role of business and the nonprofit community in public policy, the rise of the importance of economic regions in the United States, and international policy issues. Our focus is to make an immediate impact at the intersection of policy and politics that leads to real and lasting change. Thank you for joining us as we convene, communicate, and collaborate.
Hey, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today for Labor and Economic Policies in Food Industries with Sine Fellow Daniella Senior as part of our Spring 2024 Sine Fellows program. My name is Ethan Poots, and I'm a student associate here with Sine. On behalf of the Sine Institute and myself, we are so pleased you have joined us today. The Sine Institute is a laboratory for university-wide collaboration and an incubator for policy innovation, convening the best and brightest across the public, private, academic, and nonprofit sectors, as well as journalism. The Institute is where the brightest minds engage to promote common ground and nonpartisan solutions. It is where American University comes to convene, communicate, and collaborate. Today, we are thrilled to welcome back to the campus Daniella Senior. She is the CEO and founder of the fabulous DC-based Colada Shop, and also the owner of Serenata and Zumo, as well as a co-founder of Bresca. As a culinary ambassador for the U.S. Department of State, a member of the Latino Economic Network Advisory Committee, and a fellow of the Culinary Institute of America Society, Daniella is a true advocate for the culinary arts and their impact on society. Joining Daniella today is Sarela Herrada, who is the co-founder of SIMPLi, a leading regenerative food company with global operations. Through her company, she has brought to market the first regenerative organic certified ingredients from South America to the United States. Raised in Lima, Peru, in a family deeply rooted in organic farming, she later pursued an industrial engineering degree from Penn State University. With a career spanning roles at Mayorga Organics, Nike, and Cava, Sarela also serves on the board of directors for the Regenerative Organic Alliance, championing fairer food systems and community development worldwide through SIMPLi's innovative pantry products. Please welcome Daniella Senior, and Sarela Herrada.
Thank you, guys. Very excited to have Sarela here today and talk about this very important subject and with a focus on supply chain. But as if you were here in the last seminar, just want to kind of set some, I would say, ground basic information as to kind of why this subject is so important. So starting with the key labor rights and protections for immigrant women. Labor rights and protections play ultimately really a crucial role in protection of all workers. And immigrant women tend to be really at the bottom of that pyramid. So having regulations that really focus and enforce ultimately the protections of those rights is really, really important, so we can have safety standards, anti-discrimination laws, and just provide well-being for these women in the food industry. In addition, we have equal employment opportunities. There's a lot of discrimination with immigrant women in that aspect, especially when it goes into obviously legal status and taking a lot of advantage of, oh, what's your legal status? They still get hired for employment. It's not that it's not happening, but then the wages that these women are getting paid are substantially lower than their counterparts. They're also forced to work extensive hours, have no safety, protection, especially when we're talking in the fields where there's a lot of typically pesticides, not at SIMPLi, but in a lot, realistically, in a lot of farming, a lot of pesticides, a lot of chemicals. They do not have the appropriate gear. There's not a lot of oversight in these regards. We also have the immigration policies that ultimately affect all these issues. And these are ultimately very revolving. And why are they revolving? It depends ultimately who's in office, right? So these policies keep changing, and the path to citizenship, a path to legal status really keeps moving. It's a moving target when we're already talking at a significantly lack of, like, these women tend to have not a lot of access to information. There's barriers in regards to language, obviously, education, and just even if the information is out there, a lot of the times they're not available in Spanish or other languages that are easily to understand. They just don't even know where to go and get it. So yes, there are a lot of organizations supporting immigrant women. However, the access to that information tends to be one of the most critical items to address here. With that also is just the access to education and training and mentorship. So we have a lot of women, immigrant women, that end up in food systems because it's one of the easiest to get into. However, these women might have had a legal degree, even sometimes they're even doctors, and they just can't really practice here. So they're at times highly intelligent, highly educated. However, the system within the United States does not allow them to really practice, and being able to shift that and access, provide access to training that can at least allow them to apply some of their skills so they can grow, even if it's within food systems, grow to positions of leadership. That is one of the critical things to address is, we'll talk about some facts, but there's a lot of women within food systems, and very little of them are actually in leadership positions. So that has a significant impact on how their quality of life, ultimately their progression and being able to advance. And then as well, social support services, childcare. One of the things that I continuously advocate for is one of the major challenges for immigrant women and women overall in this country, especially being, talking from DC, having one of the highest, if not the highest, childcare costs in the entire nation. It is something that is really impactful as well in career progression for women, and affecting in disproportionate amount immigrant women as well. So through immigration policy aspects, there's a number of visas. They are capped. They do have to go through employers. There is decreased naturalization rates at the current moment, and more border apprehensions, again, depending on the political climate where you are in the States. And we've also seen an increase of visa overstays, which then ultimately, just does shift and create more, I would say more of an argument as to why there have to be less visas. And, it's a vicious circle. So we talked a little bit about the education and training. I just want to emphasize a little bit the access to education, vocational training, language education, and mentorship specifically. Having someone to look up to that understands your struggles, that has been through that path, that you can see that person made it. That's why it's very important to have other women in leadership, immigrant women in leadership. So, these young women coming up, and even older women they can have their American dream too. They can say, like, this person has done it, I can do it too. The amount of inspiration that creates, but also the access and ability through a mentorship program to provide information to them is just a critical step. that's often not really, it's not significant, because if we're talking, there's very little women at the top, and then very, very little immigrant women at the top. There's not a lot of mentors out there that understand specifically the challenges and struggles of these particular women to be able to provide them with that path. Some just global standards to help the supply chain aspect and just help women overall. It's just setting global agreements with just fundamental human rights. Again, we're talking access to childcare, access to safety, defining labor laws, and things that are actually enforced. Because there is a lot of organizations out there pushing, to shift that policy. But we see, like, there's certain organizations, third-party organizations, and Sarela will talk a little bit in detail about that outside of governmental institutions that are actually like doing the safety checks on these things. But from a actual governmental aspect, there's very little checks into what we're using as a marketing strategy a lot of the times of how we're getting our food. It's actually impacting the workers in the fields. So I think just pushing and requiring food companies and the whole ecosystem to provide better working conditions, and also providing access to information through mentorship and other programs, and eliminating language barriers is really crucial in this supply chain ecosystem. So that being said, Sarela, welcome. So we heard a little bit about your bio, but I want to just, why don't you tell me why you started SIMPLi?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first, I'm honored to be here today and talk to you all, share a little bit more about myself, my experience, and what I'm being able to build and what I'm being able to see in international supply chains, and how that affects the immigrant woman and the workforce in general. Before I get started, who is familiar with regenerative organic agriculture? Okay, awesome. And who has been affected or knows someone that's been affected by climate change? Okay, so there's a link into these two, and we're going to dive into that a little bit about the work that we do. So before I get to that, I'm Sarela. I have been in the food industry for 15 years, and I have really been focused my whole career on to truly deeply understand how domestic and global supply chains are built and how we prioritize the food systems in the US system. I was born in Lima, Peru, and I was fortunate enough to be exposed to the biodiversity that a beautiful country like Peru has. Peru is the home of Machu Picchu, of the Inca Empire. It has a beautiful Pacific waterfront. It has the beautiful Andes Mountains where Machu Picchu sits, and it has the Amazon. 60% of the country, in fact, is covered on this Amazon rainforest. So growing up, fresh food with flavor, nutrient density, stories coming from the Andes and the rainforest. It was the status quo, right? And you see this a lot with immigrant families, not only coming from South America and Latin America, but also from Africa or Europe. I moved to the US when I was 14 years old with my mom to Rockville, Maryland, to pursue the American dream. Like millions of immigrants move here. And my mom, being a single mom at that time with me, we really fought for me to be able to be here and share my story with you today. And I remember when we moved to the US, I was so excited to be embedded into what you see through Hollywood, the American culture, the cafeterias, the access to everything if you really want it. And going to the grocery store was one of those experiences. I just remember loving seeing the aisles, the 20 different brands of cereals, the Snicker bars that you have accessible. I ate my way through every single waffle with maple syrup. And when I just wanted to go back to who I was and to my healthy eating habits, I remember having, and Daniela and I talked about this because we have a similar experience. I remember vividly having a bite of a strawberry, and that strawberry here in Montgomery County just did not have the same taste that a strawberry did back at home.
For me, it was a tomato. I was just like, what is this? It's just like, no, it's just like, it was super mealy, just didn't really have any flavor. It was so pretty though.
Yeah.
Super pretty, very red, very perfect on the outside, yet the flavor wasn't following through. It's kind of these empty foods, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And as a 14-year-old, you are very curious and you really want to understand why. So I have spent my whole career understanding why and trying to improve the food system for our diets. Before I started SIMPLi, I have had experience building global supply chains. I was part of Cava. I was the third employee, moved to DC. There were 3 restaurants. One here in Tenleytown was the third restaurant that we opened right when I started. And I left when we were about 150 locations. And I led everything to do with food. So if you like Cava, you're welcome. That was my team. We did a lot of development, R&D, and starting to understand how local agriculture in the Eastern Shore or in Vineland, New Jersey, or out in Salinas, California, or in Arizona, we would be able to connect it to those markets. But during my time at Cava, I realized that it was very difficult at scale to find healthy foods. And as a buyer and someone that was in a position to bring those items to you all, it was very difficult. So I saw a big opportunity with to create SIMPLi. And what we do at SIMPLi is we work directly with international farming communities that are smallholders or indigenous farming communities that are growing products with incredible stories, with incredible nutrient density from where it should grown or has grown for thousands of years. And we bring that here to the market and try and just tell you that story of why buying beans or wine oils, buying products that you might not think are sexy, like an egg or a chicken, you should understand where food comes from, because those are the basics that are really driving the impact into our soil health that is really impacting our climate. So I started SIMPLi in January 2020 with my husband at that time, and we took all our savings and imported 3 containers, one from Greece, extra virgin olive oil from Greece, from the Sparta region, working with incredible farmers that have olive groves in that area for thousands of years. There's a lot of fraudulent activity that happens in the olive oil commodity market. So we wanted to bring that product and tell the story why non-diluted olive oil is better for you, higher antioxidants, and it's a super healthy food. Kalamata olives from Sparta, from the Kalamata region of Greece, and then quinoa from Peru, connecting that deep relationship to where I'm from. And we launched in food service. So we work with Pizza, with Little Beat, and Be Good up in Boston, but COVID hit and we had 140,000 pounds stuck in a warehouse and nowhere to go, and all our savings in one place. But then we had to pivot, and then we grew into meal kits. We grew into retail. Fast forward to 4 years today. You can find us in Whole Foods nationwide, in your local store out here, supermarkets. We're in over 16,000 product placements in retail. We also work with 3,000 restaurant stores across the US, Colada Shop being one of them, Sweet Green Chopped. If you've been to any of these restaurants, you have probably experienced a SIMPLi experience in being able to support how true agriculture should be done.
Yeah. No, it's pretty amazing. I'm just gonna say, pretty amazing the work that you've done. And when we were talking, you talked a lot about your goal to just have systematic change. Can you expand on that a little bit, and in your goals there?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the last 15 years, the big realization that I had is that United States food agriculture prioritizes foods with chemicals and foods that are processed. Is just how the structure is set up today. It was a structure that it was set up after World War II to feed the millions of people that this country has. But as we have progressed in the last 60 years, that food system hasn't changed. And what has created, it has created this massive industrialization. And we saw that during COVID, when people were home, the levels of greenhouse emissions decreased because the industrialization decreased. And it's not that humans or the systems that we have built didn't have a great purpose to begin with. It's just that we have gone so far to look into its emissions and its footprint that is leaving into the soil and into the earth. So one of the goals and one of the things that I see that is going to happen in the food system, and we have seen in other industries, is that the demand of healthy foods, and we're starting to see with Generation Z, is that they're moving away from processed foods. They're moving away from healthy foods. It's a generation that doesn't drink, that doesn't prioritize drinking. They prioritize healthy eating. They prioritize, who's a Gen Zer here? The majority of you guys? Am I saying that right? That you care where your food comes from and you want to know a little bit more, well, at least more than we did. And I don't know about drinking. You guys are still in school, but overall, it's a generation that is pushing the route and the change that the consumer has to have in order for big ag to make its change. So when you have a food system that subsidizes commodities like corn, like soy, to feed cattle, to feed the sugar industry that is used in Coca-Cola, this food is subsidized for the customers rather than prioritizing healthy foods for you. That's why when you go to the supermarket, buying an organic apple is more expensive than buying a candy bar. Not because of the cost. Is the final cost to you that you're paying because the government is subsidizing the cost internally. At the end of the day, you're paying about the same, but in reality is that behind the scenes, some of the cost is being subsidized. So when I look into systematic change, is how do we push policy to make those changes? How is the consumer starting to understand and demanding change at the policy level? And then can the supply of the world change fast enough to support that demand that we're going to start to see?
We're still at a point, guys, that in the current farm bill, like fruits and vegetables are specialty crops.
Mm-hmm.
Like, think about that. How are fruits and vegetables specialty? That should be like the bare minimum. But right now, like, no, it's basically prioritizing corn and prioritizing things that are sugar-based, basically, and, that are not necessarily good for you. But like Sarela is saying, it's like that's shifting because what you want to eat is shifting. And that's gonna, that supply and demand, it's gonna get to a point that the demand's gonna be greater than the supply. And that's gonna have a big shift in, what happens, and ultimately force that policy to go through and hopefully get to a point where our farm bill is not specialty crops, fruits and vegetables, right? And that we're getting access and actually have subsidized, like you see in a lot of parts of Europe and parts of the world, where those are the items that are actually prioritized. Because it's, going back to regenerative and things that are good for you, it's like we are what we eat ultimately, right? And it's that has a big impact. But now taking it back, thank you, taking it back a little bit more to the immigrant women side of things. Because I think that's a great foundation, just understanding like what's, around, what's happening really with our food systems, period, to then what are the immigrant women contributions within that food system. So Sarela, can you talk a little bit about like the challenges and the contributions of immigrant women within the food supply chain, and like, how many women are in the food supply chain?
Yeah, absolutely. So the majority of fruit, vegetables, produce that we consume in the United States come from two regions. One is in California, which is Salinas Valley by Monterey. And the second one is in Arizona. And it depends on the time of the year, the rotational of the systems happen. It's about 60 to 70% of your vegetables come from there and feeds the whole United States. That workforce, 70% of that workforce that operates there, it's immigrant workers that come through immigrant visas. And out of those immigrant workers, 40% are women. So think about that, right? It's a big, the people that are touching, and I have been to these fields where you just see, as far as the eye can see, the field goes, and you just see a wave of immigrant workers coming at you as they cut the lettuce hand by hand, the romaine lettuce, and they just put it on boxes and they finish the field and they go to the next one. This is the workforce that is feeding America today. And we have to understand what are their conditions, what are their working conditions, and how are they being tied to your everyday diet. Those women, those 40% of the immigrant agriculture food women, if you look into the pyramid of leadership that leads these companies, right? That is going to be your General Mills, your PepsiCo, your Driscoll's, your Chiquitas, all the massive
Conglomerates.
food conglomerates, Church Brothers that operate on these fields. 17% of women are in upper management and 3% of women are on the C-suite level. So the dispersity that we see not only at the immigrant worker level, but as you move up into an organization and the representation for the consumer base, which is us, right, is not being represented by the decisions that are being made. So that gap right there is incredibly massive. And there's a lot of reasonings behind that is happening. These women are put in a position where their qualifications that they have obtained in their country might not translate to the qualifications into the US. And we see that all the time. And Daniela spoke to this, where you might have understanding of somewhat of a higher education, but then through your visa program, you're put into lower level wage positions. There's a language barrier. It's very difficult to learn English if you're not given the tools. But if you're giving the tools, there's a path towards learning a language and being proficient to that. So the accessibility of learning is just not giving. And the accessibility of mentorship, if there's only 3% on the top to a workforce that 40% are women, there's just not going to be lack of mentorship for be able to grow and create a diverse team as the organization grows.
And not only that, these women, even compared to, their counterparts, even immigrant men counterparts, are only making about 75% of the wages. So, that's also a huge, issue. They're making less money for the same work. They have childcare responsibilities. They are not, being given tools to be able to, again, grow. We're not really following the American dream here. It's not like you put in effort and you're getting results, right? It's like they do not have access to grow. It's like here's a task, we're doing a job that Americans, quite frankly, do not want to do, especially in the field. They're getting paid less. Just simply by being a woman, then again, their male counterparts, and have additional responsibility. So like their home ecosystem looks different. So, again, these are changes through policy that by establishing, not only having regulations, but actually following through and enforcing them, that, going into office and demanding these changes to be done by our Congress people is crucial for advancement. And again, just I want to point out, it's like 40% of the labor force. When you're eating, it's like, think about that in proportion. 40% of that food is coming from immigrant women. And, she's speaking statistically of like fields, but it's even a lot higher when we talk about like meat processing plants. In the meat processing and poultry processing plants, we're talking about 75%. So 40% in the field, 75% in processing plants of meat. So meat, poultry. So like basically how many immigrant women are touching our food and the impact, yet we're not giving them any safeguards, any decency for that matter, right? Like access to healthcare, childcare, protections from getting sick. There's the working conditions, the amount of hours and no overtime pay that happen continuously.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And one thing to add as well is the exposure of the working conditions at these levels are brutal. I have seen it on the fields when a food system is built on pesticides, herbicides, glyphosates that are bad for the field, for the harvest that is coming out, is also exposure for the workers. We're working with chemicals that are being put by Monsanto that have been proven to have been linked to cancer. And California has passed a law that they have to be removed from agriculture, specifically talking about glyphosates, which is prohibited in every other country outside of the United States.
So not only are we not giving them healthcare, we're making them sick.
Yeah.
So like, think about that. They're putting the food at our tables. They're considered during, global pandemics, essential workers, but we're not giving them protections to even not get sick from what we're eating ultimately, or the pesticides. Like, so think about ultimately just a little food for thought, like the hypocrisy there, because it's pretty wild, right? It's just again, they're doing work that most Americans don't want to do. We still want to eat. We still love our lovely lettuces and food beautifully packaged at Whole Foods, right? Yet we're not protecting the people, and ultimately just the people. It doesn't matter if it's immigrant women. It's but again, in this case, it's really is we're not protecting the people that are bringing such an important part of our lives that's essential for our living, right? So yeah. And yeah, when we were talking and just tying this, we talked a little bit how these policies and what impact the experiences of these immigrant women have in just various segments of that supply chain. And you told me a beautiful story about Yolanda.
Yeah.
And I want you to share that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm very fortunate to work with farmers all across the globe. I work out of 6 countries: Greece, Ukraine, Peru, Paraguay, Argentina, and Brazil. So I get to meet incredible people on the ground that are doing the right thing for the soil, for the crop, for the environment, and for us as consumers. And Yolanda is one of them. So we focused on, at SIMPLi, we focused on items that are your everyday pantry staples: your grains, your beans, your oils, and your spices. And I started with the products that I told you guys: the oil, the Kalamata olives, and the quinoa from Peru. And I had no desire to continue growing into other products until I really deeply understood that in order to bring a good food product to market, you have to know where the food comes from and how it's grown and the agricultural practice behind it. So at the beginning, I mentioned to you all what regenerative organic is. Regenerative organic is the solution to the climate crisis that we're seeing today. Agriculture is the 3rd biggest contributor to the climate in green gas emissions. And it's a way of doing agriculture based on indigenous knowledge that has been down for thousands of years, from First Nations, from indigenous communities in Europe, indigenous communities in South America. And Yolanda is one of these farmers. So I met Yolanda through the community work, and she owns these beautiful salt ponds outside of Cusco. They're called maras. If anyone has been to Machu Picchu, it's a super touristy area and is now considered a national park. I had no interest to get into the salt business, but once I met Yolanda and I heard her story, I couldn't say no to commercialize this product and bring awareness to who she is and what she does. These salt ponds are if anyone has ever seen, it's just like thousands of little salt ponds in one mountain. And it comes from a stream of the Andes that feeds that water that sits on the ponds. And then with the sun, it crystallizes and it adds all the minerals from the earth. And that's how this salt is being created, with high levels of minerals, of phosphorus, obviously sodium, and calcium and other high benefits. So it's very compared to like your Himalayan salt in the market. And these little ponds, there's thousands of them. And this area was managed by an indigenous community, and given every family had 5 to 10 different ponds that they will come and operate and harvest. And because this destination is so beautiful and so close to Cusco and Machu Picchu, the government decided to make a national park. So, but the farmers had the right to this land, and they had the right to continue to operate. But once it was declared a national park, if you wanted to harvest your salt, you had to pay the government about $10 a kilo to get your salt out of your own land, that it was given to you by your generations before. It's the only way that you can operate and inherit is if you have that land ownership from previous generations. And that is very common corruption, exploitation in third world countries. And Yolanda didn't sit well with her. It's her own land. She can operate it. She doesn't have to pay the government a fee to get product out of her own land with her own hands, with her own hard work. And she fought this, and she brought it all the way up to the National Congress of Peru. She spoke. She brought a woman of a group of 20 women to come to the capital of Lima and to fight it. There's beautiful YouTube videos that have been put together by her as an activist in this market, because she wanted to protect her land, and she wanted to protect her activities that she has grown, and she wanted to protect her rights. She didn't end up winning. It's still an ongoing process, but the empowerment that Yolanda had and the force that she had to make her voice loud in a country where it's so bureaucratic and it's against you to speak up, it's so powerful. And like Yolanda, there's thousands of other stories on how farmers are being pressured down and not putting in a place where their activity is a business and it needs to be prioritized as such.
And SIMPLi works with organizations, it's Fair Life, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Fair Life that, help like ultimately monitor what's happening with a lot of these farmers. When companies are claiming, we're working with farmers, giving them fair wages, paying them correctly, but there's, these organizations are third parties. This is not really coming from, there's not really a lot of policy ultimately regulating what is being put and marketed to consumers.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why, knowing where your food comes from and really knowing like ultimately money is power, and what you choose to buy and what you choose to support, based on the practices. It costs more money to put great food out there. Mm-hmm. It's a reality, because that means that, there's farmers behind that food that are getting paid more potentially, right? And they're being treated well. There's a lot, we see it a lot with coffee, fairly traded, so I would say that's probably one of the most marketable ones that I've seen in the US with working with farmers. But I've also seen a lot of companies just write it on labels and it's not really true, right? So like doing research when you're choosing where to spend your money, and understanding that, yes, these beans might cost $1 more than these, but you're buying from a huge company that's just exploiting their workers versus a company that's really taking care of of their workers and providing living wages and a fair life ultimately, right? So fair life, right? So it's really important where we put our money and we do it in doing our research, and and in my position, as we buy a lot through wholesale, and having an opportunity to work with companies like SIMPLi that, yes, when we buy our beans, we use a lot of beans for, black beans is one of the staples in Cuban cuisine, and like knowing where that's coming from and that the people behind that are being treated well. And it's a difficult thing to do, because then I'll be competing with other people in the, casual food. It's like, why is your food more expensive? Well, I'm not, a huge company that has the buying power to really move the needle in supply chain, but we're also using our buying power to buy things that are supporting women, supporting people, and not just buying things that ultimately damage the supply chain ecosystem and, contribute to the problem. But getting that message out and for people to understand the value of that is not an easy task. Sometimes people just want to pay less, right? They just want that value. And it's understanding your consumer and knowing, like, for myself as a business owner, where do I put the energy, how far can I go here, where can I save in other areas so I can still support those things. And it's hard, and not only with food, also with plastics, right? Like, just things affecting, we use a lot of paper supplies. That's also in my world at this point, it's also part of the food supply chain, right? It's like, when we are deciding to use like sugarcane pulp and to-go-ware, that's 5 times the price as using styrofoam that's killing the planet. Consumers don't necessarily say, well, I'm supporting the environment, right? It's more like, well, this is more expensive. So it's like, really, as a whole, understanding like every piece of what we consume, like, does have an impact. And there's, like, as you were saying, there's millions of stories like Yolanda, and yes, she's in Peru. There's a lot of them right here. It affects a lot of like our Native American communities where land's taken away, and same scenarios happen. And a lot of, especially like women out there that are left powerless. So I love Yolanda's story because it's, a powerful woman that decided to speak up. But the reality is that most women don't, because they do not have the resources, the education, language barriers, or just the courage, ultimately, because in most places they're suppressed a bit. So it's important to just, again, understand these things. And when stories like Yolanda come to light and they've made it all the way there, the fact that from literally a pretty secluded area, touristy, but coming from a pretty secluded area to go into take this all the way up to Congress and fight this, it takes a lot. We're talking about a rural farmer taking and saying, this is my land, I am demanding my rights, and again, she owned this piece of land. There's a lot of women that do not, that they're just workers within that land, but that don't have that power to speak up. And even as beautiful as their story is, she's still hasn't won her case in that regard. So so how ultimately, Sarela, do you think like labor policies, both like here and internationally, just like, do they connect to each other? Like, do you see an impact when like when you were buying, especially like huge quantities from Kava, like, how do they connect? How do the from a legal standpoint or policy standpoint, like, do the laws here impact?
Absolutely. Yeah, they do. It's the labor trading, the trade laws that are put in place. So we have free trade with Mexico. It allows us also to have worker visa accessibility. If right now we have high tariffs with China, so it limits the inputs coming in from China. We have free trade working right now with Peru. We're looking into implementing a free trade agreement with Argentina and the change of policy and leadership that the country has had. We don't have one with Paraguay. Brazil still has one today, mainly driven by cattle imports. But when things happen and change in a global scenario for supply chain, it deeply changes the rules of the game here internationally as well, because then you're decreasing the amount of labor or increasing the amount of imports that you have in the market at a lower cost. So then you don't want to produce as much domestically, and you start to look at the macroeconomic trends that could be impacting different variables towards the GDP. So it is deeply connected, and it absolutely affects the quality of food that we're being sold and is being offered to consumers at the supermarkets or restaurants as well. When I mentioned that regenerative organic is that solution to agriculture, is because it doesn't prioritize those chemicals. It doesn't prioritize those fertilizers that the U.S. Food system does. So when you have more imports that are being brought internationally, sometimes the majority of the time, those foods are healthier. So your diet changes also on what's being offered to you on the table. But ultimately, what we want to do is change how the food system is set up here. So we don't have to fully depend on imports for quality of food. And we're starting to see that, which is incredible to see how much California is really leading the movement of organic and regenerative agriculture changing over. And the big difference, as I mentioned, is the use of those chemicals on the field, but it goes deeper than that. It goes into not using one plot of land to grow the same food year after year and after year. So regenerative organic focuses on to rotational crops. So if you're growing a grain, you want to rotate it with a bean. So that bean can provide nitrogen to the soil, so that soil becomes richer. Or you want to rotate it with maybe a potato, or you want to rotate it with something that has, or a carrot that has longer roots. The longer the roots in the soil, the more it can take out carbon from the environment and sequester all the way down. And the more enriches that soil for the next crop to come in and have higher nutrient density. So it's not only about the inputs that you put in the land, but it's the land management. So those rotational crop concepts, covering the crop, when it gets really cold in the winter here in the Midwest or in the East Coast, you want to cover your land so it doesn't create that frosting on top. So you can cover it with corn husk, or you can cover it with just waste of vegetables, and then that will keep the nutrient density of the ground so it doesn't freeze below temperature. So there's different techniques that we're starting to implement in the US, and policy hopefully is going to be able to incentivize more. But yes, when labor policies change internationally and domestically, are deeply connected to our GDP.
Super, super critical. And I think, the women's impact in this, like
Mhm.
what have we seen internationally? Who's taking care of the land and coming up with these solutions that are ultimately, being
Yeah.
implemented here?
Yeah, it's interesting because internationally, what I have seen is it's mainly the women that work the land versus men. Men are taking jobs that are a little bit more physically, even though farming is very physically involved, the involvement is high, but they will do more in towards like mining or work that takes a little bit more of heavy weight. So it's the women that stay and work these fields. And not only because they have to, but because they're so much more connected to the emotional care of the land. And they look at it more as, if the land is providing something to me, I gotta be able to give back to that land, right? And it's not kind of like an abused relationship of just extract value. It really is about giving back. So it goes back into those concepts of how do I support my ecosystem? Here in the US, farming is mainly done at a family level. So you see a lot of family farms that are being driven. And usually when you look at big ag is usually done by big companies that outsource labor. And that's where the immigrant workforce comes in.
Yeah. And I think also things that we've learned from what other countries are doing, that have helped sustain these women working the fields, is we've seen a lot of cooperatives, right?
Mhm. Yes.
Of women. And I've had experience with one at one point in my career. I actually, in Peru, I work with a Pisco brand in Peru, and we work primarily with a cooperative of women that had been abused and had left their husbands, and were
Yeah.
single mothers primarily, and they helped each other, and they basically picked the grapes, and it became this own ecosystem, and they protected each other and really supported each other. And you've
Mhm.
seen the same with, you worked with one with quinoa, correct?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think taking some of those things of like, how can we build networks here that women can support each other is really also critical, because again, the access to mentorship is really low, right? So like, if we're not gonna go up and look up and find an answer there, or find that inspiration and have that access, building systems that ultimately we can look next to each other and have that ecosystem for these women farmers and that are in our supply chain that are able to get themselves out of situations where they're not treated fairly, where there's us having to support abuse. But sometimes those decisions are very hard to make because they have a child to feed or themselves to feed, and they need that paycheck just to eat. So I think solutions and such as cooperatives and things that we can create that dynamic would be something really fantastic if we could start here in the US as well.
Yeah.
And I think, what would you say would be some of like the higher, like even furthermore, the potential like economic and a social impact of having more immigrant women in C-suite levels or in leadership positions represented?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's no surprise or we all are aware of the benefits of having a diverse, equity, and inclusive work environment, a community. It provides different perspectives to come to a solution, and being able to create an opportunity that is equitable for everyone. So the outcomes of working as a team in a collaborative space that is driven by diversity it benefits the company, because and someone explained this to me so clearly, coming from Glassdoor. It was the chief people officer at Glassdoor, that companies should be incentivized to have a really strong DEI program, because you want to be able to, if you look at an employee at a company, and you want to be able to, you want this employee to operate at 100% efficiency, and you want this person to be the best version that can be from a professional level, you got to make sure this person is comfortable in the work environment. And if you're able to create a work environment that is inclusive of all, that creates equity and diversity, the employee is going to be able to hit that 100% proficiency. So by having a strong, inclusive, equitable, and diverse work environment, it creates a higher level of efficiency of your workforce, right? So it's deeply connected to the bottom line of an organization. So it's not only the benefits of diverse output and creativity and innovation, but it's also deeply tied to the cost of an organization when you look at your payroll expenses. So when we look at diversity of the workforce, I think immigrant women or men just provide a different perspective because of the experiences they've had in their previous lives or in their previous countries that someone else might not have. So it just provides that perspective into the conversation. It also allows for mentorship to happen and accessibility. I think the example of COP that you mentioned that happens internationally is because as humans, we gravitate towards someone that is like us or have common things in common or is struggling through the same thing. So if you have a community, a COP, or someone that you can look up to, that you can relate, then your path doesn't feel that lonely. And it feels that you have someone that is rooting for you. So mentorship, community is so important to be able to develop a path for people that might not see it when they're beginning their career stage.
Thank you. That was awesome. I want to wrap it up there. Do you guys have any questions? Last time we had a lot of questions. I want to make sure we had some time to discuss further anything. I find it deeply fascinating, the whole supply chain and how everything has such an impact on our lives. So
So I grew up like in a dairy environment. So the Yellow family is like 100 head of cattle.
Yeah.
And you're mentioning like working with like international sources with food. I was wondering, it is easier to like suppress an abusive community when they're just like California or just in Arizona? Is there like networks trying to connect? Like there's individuals who have somewhat of ag experience with, you know, like the Midwest or the Southeast, because there are like, I think plenty of people whose families just sell the cattle or something. That's just how we look at it.
Yeah, absolutely. And what state were you based out of?
Tennessee.
Tennessee. Yeah. I know a few brands in the dairy industry that do these programs really well. Alexander Farms being California, Stonyfield, being in Vermont as well. And, there is a huge network of dairy farmers in the United States that are really fighting for their rights because, to your point, what have seen in the dairy industry in the US is that it's outsourced. So you have a brand like Stonyfield come in and then just buy your milk to be sold under their brand rather than having family farms ran the product or the selling points of those goods, if that is milk, cheese, or any value add on their products. So there's a huge movement happening right now in the US. It's driven in Texas, is where it's being positioned because Texas has a big dairy output as well, of young leaders that are looking into how can their generation of farmers really drive the dairy industry versus more from a brand driven perspective. And also milk can be commoditized. So the pricing fluctuation sometimes is driven by the market versus by the farmer. So that's a big tension point in the market as well. And I'm happy to share with you what that organization is too afterwards. Yeah.
I just wanted to, I was wondering because I'm from a family that is like privileged enough to be able to afford like the nicer foods despite the subsidies of like the healthier foods and vegetables. And I'm very grateful for that and I recognize my privilege there, but I know that so many people in this country are not able to do that. And I know like the crazy, I work for the North Texas Food Bank, I'm from Dallas. And I've seen the crazy high numbers of people who just can't get food at all even.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, like, how do we bring these benefits to them? And like, do you see that happening? Do you think there's a path forward? Because I know, like, do you think there's a path to get these people that level of healthy food and keep all of these farmers like well paid and like keep that equity and everything available? Yeah, that is what the US food system has to change, because for those families to afford, and that's the problem. So 7% of total agriculture in the United States is organic. That's it. It's really, really tiny, right? So there's so much change that needs to happen to get to those healthy levels of food. It's a systematic food change system. And those low-income families don't have access to healthy foods because the food stamps or the subsidies that they have is for processed foods, right? For your mac and cheeses or for your foods that are just your cereals that are just processed with food coloratives and so on.
That then are being incentivized by lobbyists in the Hill.
Exactly.
Let's be real, because you think the small farmer has money to advocate for fresh fruits and vegetables. No, it's these very large conglomerates that have the access to have someone be fighting for them and their rights because, you know, they need more, right? And that shifts ultimately how things like the Farm Bill are put together. And the Farm Bill has a tremendous impact on then basically, because a large part of that is those food stamps, you know, it's driven a lot by that. So it's just like, who's fighting for what? And when, again, we have literally fruits and vegetables considered specialty, but yet you have cereal being something that's just, you know, commoditized, there is an issue. And like it says, ultimately, we really have to dive into that and demand for policy change. But as Sarela was mentioning, that also what we're buying is shifting, which will ultimately kind of force them to.
That's the big change. So you can vote with your dollars today when you go to the supermarket and you make a purchase. Because the more that's where the hope on the food industry is happening right now, because your generation is moving that change where you will go to Whole Foods and buy product, even if you are not in the workforce and don't have a salary and disposable income, you will use your dollars to buy healthier choices, to go to Colada Shop versus McDonald's. And that is changing the way that the food retailers are seeing what to put on the shelves. And then our hope is that it's going to drive policy, because your consumer wave is educating not only within you all, but also your parents. We're seeing a huge piece of you're going home and you're educating your parents on how to buy healthy. And now your parents are making healthy decisions as well on their diets because of the way that you're consuming and connecting to brands and connecting to food. So the change has to be at a policy level, because it is processed foods is being subsidized. And that's why low income families can afford that.
Yeah, and I think there's a level of misinformation too. I think, maybe not when you were growing up, but when I was growing up, margarine was the healthy thing to eat, right? And then it was clogging all of our arteries, and then people started having heart attacks, right? So but again, it goes back to who has the money, right? Obviously, unprocessed foods, organic foods, fruits and vegetables is where we should be focusing the energy. And that's ultimately, these communities that you're talking about are also our sickest communities, because they also don't have access to childcare. And we have, sorry, not food.
Healthcare.
Yes, healthcare. And then we're getting them sicker ultimately by the foods that they're putting into their bodies, and not providing them with fresh fruits and vegetables. And a lot of them live in food deserts. They only have processed foods available to them, which is also part of that systematic problem in this country.
I wanted to go back to the Cusco salt flats, because in the class tonight we're actually talking about land grabbing. And so that's exactly the discussion of how when the government might claim or label something as a conservation area, suddenly the traditional landowners can't operate on there. So I'd be curious how, that's more like a policy discussion. So I'd be really curious how you commercializing that salt, how has that made an impact? Has it brought more of a voice to them? So you talk about
yeah, absolutely. And I was telling Daniela too, I guess the positive side of Yolanda's story is that I've been working with her for 3 years now. And every year I spend 3 months in South America doing sourcing trips. And every time I go back to her community, you can see actual development, which is incredible. So in the last 3 years, she has opened a small shop. So now herself, and this is a co-op of women that run this program, sell salt to the tourists that come into the park. She's opened a restaurant. So now everyone in that community is operating within this restaurant as well. So it's a co-op driven restaurant and store. And she's working on operating her own facility where she can refine the salt a bit more. So every year we're just starting to see development. And it's one of the metrics that is really important with us internally, to be able to see not only monetary development, but educational development, which to me is probably, for SIMPLi, is the most important, is how do you create educational development at the community level that eventually will drive economic development as well.
And that's, crucial. It's not only, giving them the research, so I would say simply giving them the opportunity, open those doors. But now it's you're building a whole community ecosystem that's, ultimately pushing that economy to go further. And I've seen that it would work with Jose Andres and places actually like Haiti, where it's not just give them bread, it's let's build a bakery and help them teach them how to process. That's why the education piece. And then that they know now they're selling that bread, and now it's become, it becomes a business, and now they're self-sustained. It's not just about giving, it's about teaching and ultimately creating an ecosystem that they're that's sustainable. It's not, there's just so much that we can do, giving we can do. It's just but we can share resources, we can teach communities how to become better, and give them opportunities, because we want those great products too. So awesome, great questions.
The thing you had talked about, you asked us, of us have experienced the effects of climate change.
Mhm.
And I just kind of stuck with it because, in the warming world, and it'll completely impact the devastation of these food systems. And so I'm just curious, what are the effects of climate change that you see?
Yeah.
And also, I kind of got stuck on going to creeks and olive groves that have been there thousands of years. But then how is climate change?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good question. You cannot be in a conversation with a farmer and for a farmer not to bring climate change within the first 10 minutes. If you want to go meet a farmer an hour out in the Eastern Shore of Maryland in Salisbury, it's a massive area of agriculture in the state of Maryland because it's so deeply affected on their everyday. Rain seasons are coming late. Rain is not happening at all. On the olive oil market specifically, olive oil market is at its all-time high. I used to buy a liter of olive oil about $5 the kilo at country of origin. Right now it's about 10. It's a little bit more than double into the market because it has been such a hot year in Spain that the yield has been cut into half. So if you go to your grocery stores, your extra virgin olive oil prices are going to be up the roof, and it's gonna stay high for the rest of the year, because those olive groves have been there for
And there's
thousands of years
shortages.
and massive shortages.
Mhm.
They've been there for thousands of years. Is not getting the proper irrigation that it needs naturally. So now it has to now if natural irrigation, meaning rain, if an area that was dependent on just a rain season, now you have to install irrigation. So you have to create little channels and put water systems to irrigate the plants. But because you don't adapt quickly, then these trees just burn. And then that's where you see the wildfires happening that you saw in Greece 2 years ago. So climate change is so in top of their mind of every farmer that I have ever spoken to, because they're so dependent on the conditions that are happening with Mother Earth. And it is warming up. And if we don't reverse how we're doing agriculture, which is the third biggest contributor into after energy, we're going to see we're producing more green gas emissions for a tool like agriculture that can actually be sequestering and fighting that back.
I was just wondering, about that, how is this conversation being missed, like, on the Hill, or it's, like, most important for, because, like, when you follow a drought, you kind of follow crime and, like, violence increases in a lot of communities when there's a drought. And, like, I'm a terrorism major, so terrorism increases in a lot of those communities as well. So how is this being missed on, like, I mean, on a global level, but especially on, like, the US, like, we're right next door to the Hill, how are they not understanding it, right?
Yeah.
It's we're heating up, droughts are increasing, wildfires are increasing. Like, this is a national security concern, not just a food concern.
And immigration too, because with climate change, our borders, I mean, it's what's happening right now. There's a lot of immigration happening because the world is heating up. There's areas that are going to be uninhabitable and people have to move somewhere. And the United States, being another atmosphere, is positioned to be one of the later stages, being away from the equator line of climate change. So it's policy. There's a great documentary that I would suggest for you guys to watch. It's called Common Ground. In Netflix, there's one called Kiss the Ground. It's out there today, and it talks about, it's the kind of like the first film about this movement that I speak to. And then the second one is called Common Ground. I know the producer, he's working on getting distribution rights with Netflix as for his second film, but look it up. It's in independent films. One is Netflix, the other one just came out, and it talks about all this and what's happening at a policy level as well.
But also, just kind of bring it back, it's just who's in the Hill, on the
Mhm.
Hill, right? It's not your farmers. It's again, it's people pushing very specific agendas. And we're talking, the people that are also pushing genetically modified
Yeah.
foods and shifting, like highly processed foods that are less impacted, so it's not everyone gets to be on the Hill. And I think that's, the why DEI is so important, right? Why having a diverse group, not only in companies, but on the Hill, and, coming here, it's just like, we're hearing the messages from the same people ultimately. So they're not really getting, that true extent of those answers and the impacts that it has to those people and those communities. And then, as you mentioned, like how it shifts people, how it shifts, climate, how, how people have to move. Like, there's parts of even of the US that are sinking currently, like things are going to shift significantly, and it's affecting some countries more than others and at disproportionate rates. And, I think it's important that we all contribute to that. But, that's why people that are working on the land, for which are primarily women, that know more sustainable ways to take care of the land, not just take from the land, and shift practices ultimately has a long-term impact, and for your child coming on, and your children and mine, it's something that's top of mind constantly. It's just like, how is the world going to look in 20 years? We see these changes happening from year to year. It's like kind of pretty drastic at this point, how the weather and the climate has shifted. What's going to be 20 years from now?
Yeah.
Okay, maybe last question. I was thinking maybe in relationship to her question. One of the issues for agriculture scale, and we know that there's a lot of debate about how the large scale of global agro industry has created many of the problems that you're talking about here. One of which is a lack of flexibility. If you decide you don't want to grow, 10 less hectares of soy, it's actually hard to shift out of the embedded supply chain that you're operating, and there's less answers. So I'm wondering, we saw during the pandemic that global supply chains ran into some difficulties, and that caused a reassessment. I assume also in the agricultural space. And are there ways in which, like a rescaling of agriculture, along the trends like locavorians and so forth, and the rescaling of agriculture happen in ways that you seem productive, positive, toward the kinds of change that you're looking to see, or has it created other kinds of opposite companies?
Yeah, one of the main change that created COVID during supply chains, it wasn't mainly on the agricultural side, but it was on supply chain models. The United States works on a lean supply chain model, which it was really just based on lean ordering. So you keep inventory on hand for what you just need, and the adjustment of the week is really tight. So the standard deviation of what your hand is very small to your average model, which is lean supply chains. I'm sure you guys are familiar with that. What created during COVID was that because lean supply chains are so difficult to adjust and agile to long lead times, when you're talking about international supply chains that could take 2 or 3 months for goods to come in, it changed to a more vertically integrated model, which is what we see in the market today. So that's why today, when you look at domestic or imported product, is more for a resilient economy than what it was before COVID, because we have adjusted to a vertical integrated model of supply chains, taking into account for that lead time change and keeping more in-stock inventory on hand at the US level to adjust for any changes. The issue with agricultural products is your avocados, your asparagus, it goes bad. Perishables, and they go bad. So what has happened is that the imports of those products have started to transition more into domestic crops, into different areas. So they're testing in to see how some of those crops can be grown into the US at a big agriculture level, rather than implementing maybe some of those rotational crops that could drive a regenerative agriculture into the US. So I guess the two main things I have seen is adjustment of supply chain models from lean to vertical integration. And then second is bringing more in-house domestic productions of the big of the big imports. So like avocado is a big one that the US is starting to look into growing domestically versus relying on Mexico import.
Actually, I was thinking of what I was wondering, this is more towards, SIMPLi. So you said you're into like the, major things like, grain, beans, oils and seasonings. I was wondering if you see any other potential future avenues you want to go down with that to sort of expand your market.
Yeah, not in the foreseeable future, short-term future, because those categories are massive of their own and there's so much opportunity. And the way that we expanded was, can these products be complementary of each other based on where they're grown in the land? So when we started with quinoa, which it was a grain, needed to be rotated with a bean. So we expanded into a bean category if we wanted to bring the best quinoa product into the market, and just trying to understand kind of like those rotational systems. So our product innovation pipeline is really driven by the land and what can our farmers produce to transition more of their cover crops into a cash crop for an export market. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mhm. Awesome.
We'll
Yeah.
close there.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. This was an unbelievable session. Yeah. If you would like to come back for our third seminar with Daniela, that will be April 10th at 4 p.m. Am I missing one? Yeah, no. April 10th at 4 p.m. is our next one. I'm sorry. And we hope to see you there. If you would like more information, we have websites outside. Grab a snack or a drink on your way out. And thank you all so much again for joining us today.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. No, that was awesome. I really enjoyed your answer.